It's an age-old adage of Magic the Gathering that the more you play, the more blue that you end up playing, the more control and the more power you want in your games, the more choices you want, and that's what blue gives to you. It's the power of choice, the power of control, the power of intellect. It does everything in combination with all colors, and I think that's where the problem lies. In the Pauper metagame and the Pauper format in general, blue has always been a problem. It is a problem now, it was a problem before, and that's what I want to discuss today. Has it become or becoming that big problem again, like we saw a couple years back when we had to ban 3 blue cards out of the format? Are we coming to another blue winter, another deadly time in the Pauper metagame where blue is shining through? Now, I think this discussion first and foremost can be seen from the metagame breakdown itself. We take Goldfish list right here. Mono Blue Delver, Coggates, Azorius Affinity, Dimir Control. Out of the top 5 most represented decks in the metagame, Burn being 16% is a whole other discussion, by the way. About 20 to 30% of the metagame right now, plus, is represented by blue. If you don't count Grixis Affinity, Mono Blue Fairies, Jeskai, you're probably approaching about 40 to 50% of the metagame if you include it all. And then really after that, it's decks that can go underneath. What happens to counterspells once Boros just has a bunch of resolved enchantments? What happens to burn when it can just go underneath it? If the strategies are just built around beating counterspells, isn't the problem blue? Are we just letting all of these tempo control decks and just hard control decks at the end of the day get away with way too much in the Pauper metagame? I mean, this discussion starts here, but it also recently shifted. This came a rise because of Commander Masters. We saw a lot of downshifts and a lot of power coming out of this format. Obviously, the Legacy and EDH players love this in general for reprints and various things. Maybe less so the Legacy players, but the EDH players went crazy for it. But the Pauper players also did as well. I can tell from myself that if you watch any videos on this channel, I've recently been playing a whole lot of Commander Masters, thanks to One Land Spy. The downshifts that we got from this set were interesting. From all that glitters that we see in the Azorius decks right now, even in Bogles, allowing decks like, well, not Grixis Affinity, but Azorius Affinity to rise up. We're going to touch base back on artifacts later in this video, so stick around for that. But also, as I was mentioning with One Land Spy, Lotlet Giant being downshifted to provide a clean win condition for the One Land Spy archetype helped so much. It made the list so much more simpler because instead of having to loop multiple artifacts together, you just get a bunch of creatures out, you cast Dread Return with flashback, and you bring back a Lotlet Giant. That's right, Dread Return, Lotus Petal, all this stuff are at common, and this is a very sweet combo. Don't be startled by its name. It's not Cycle Storm. Goldfish listed as this, but it's One Land Spy. Cycle Storm and One Land Spy are very unique strategies, so keep that in mind. But the Blue Menace itself is not unique. It plays a lot of the same counter spells, regardless of these downshifts, and we see that a bit of ubiquity amongst the 2 big blue decks right now, and that's thanks to Cryptic Serpent. Coming out as a 6/5 with no protection ability, as with its counterpart we'll just mention, it costs blue most of the time for each instant sorcery card in your graveyard. When you cast it, it's going to cost 6 less. It's going to cost 1 less for each one I just mentioned, and its analog is Tolarian Terror. Tolarian Terror being 1 mana for a 5/5, it does have protection, but you lose that 1 power. So there is an important difference here, but the creature itself can't be denied that Cryptic Serpent is still powerful. Having an analogous creature, almost an exact reprint, is very important for consistency because you want to provide more threats for your opponents to answer. Now, this can be seen, of course, from Lorien Revealed being played so much in the Dimir control decks. It's only easy to see that it's really not that hard to feed into the Cryptic Serpent and the Tolarian Terror. So we already see the blue package come together. The threat base is already there. The Dimir control decks will be playing both of these threats. They'll play things like Delver, Gurmag Angler, Augur, Bolas, any combination of these, whatever your flavor is, but primarily Cryptic Serpents and Tolarian Terrors, a whole bunch of control spells as well. But thanks to Cryptic Serpent being printed out, a lot of folks said, why play something so complicated? You have to play tapped black lands to cast things like Snuff Out, and Cast Down is pretty sweet, but you don't really need all of this. You don't need to complicate your mana base when you could just play mono blue. Mono blue, you have Delver, Cryptic Serpent, and Tellurian Terror, and really good tempo counter spells. And that's what's important. And I think that's what's exasperating this, because the decks trying to beat blue go underneath it by playing on curve to try and force counter magic or get under it, or the decks just don't compete. You're playing blue or you're playing under blue. You can't really play over blue because of how the metagame is shaped right now. Take back to that tempo counter magic that I'm talking about, where it's not just hard counter spell, but it requires you to pay a certain cost. So if they have 1 mana left open, it can get really tricky when they're playing things like Spell Pierce or Force Spike. Specifically, Force Spike is just kind of, well, Mana Tithe was based off of this really. Counter target spell unless its controller plays 1. So this is any spell, creature, instant or sorcery, enchantment, anything, which is really powerful if your opponent's playing off tempo. They've been playing on curve, which is really important in Pauper and has been a staple of Pauper. There aren't many free spells that exist in the format. There are cheaper spells, but free spells are very rare. We're going to touch on one of them that really had to be stopped later in this video. But Force Spike is a great way to stop this. And on top of this, we have the addition of Spell Pierce, where Spell Pierce stops non-creature spells, which is great in Counter Wars. If your opponent is playing blue too, and you need to stop their counter spell, you play your Spell Pierce. And chances are they're not able to play, you know, around the Spell Pierce itself. They played a threat, they're trying to protect it with the counter spell, you go to remove it, they counter it, blah, blah, blah. The back and forth is all there. And Spell Pierce doesn't just stop the blue decks. It stops a lot more. You have cards like Journey to Nowhere, which are sorcery speed, which is a great tempo play to just counter this on your opponent's turn. Lightning Bolt, as always, a staple of the format. Heck, even Thermo cards, talking about playing on curve. This is a card that you want to play a lot of times on turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, and after that you're probably just ramping out into some giant creature when you're playing Ponza. But you play early, and that is exactly what Spell Pierce and Force Spike wants to deal with. Once you cast your Spell Pierce and your Force Spike, you know what your opponent's on, you know generally what you want to do, and then you can hold up your counter spells from there. You cast your Brainstorms at instant speed to find your counter spells, you have your threat out, and you can protect everything perfectly, whereas you've tempoed out your opponent for very little cost. Your threats are cheap, your threats are hard to interact with when it comes to Tellurian Terror, and your opponent has to cast 3 mana sorceries or 2 mana enchantments to heck even do anything. Hopefully you're tapped out. Now, there were darker times. There was a time, as I was talking about, when blue was much more powerful. And this is what I'm alluding to, in the sense that, is blue getting back to this point? It may not fully get back to that point, but maybe in a relative sense. In this current Pauper metagame, is blue just as oppressive? And that's important to know when it comes to a simple line of play. Think about it like this, right? So I'm going to talk about the ban and restricted announcement in a second, which is, imagine for me, you play a Delver of Secrets with the unbanned list from a couple years ago. You play Delver of Secrets and you're on the draw. Your opponent then untaps, plays a land, and plays Journey to Nowhere, targeting your Delver of Secrets. You then get to, well, in this case, probably have to go a little bit farther with my example. You have 2 islands out, so farther down the line in the turns, but then you get to cast Gush. You cast Gush for free, by the way. I said there are very few free spells in general in the Pauper format. Gush being one of them, returning 2 islands to your hand rather than paying Gush mana cost for 5. At instant speed, you return 2 your islands, draw 2 cards. That then allows you, with Journey to Nowhere still on the stack, to then cast Foil for free. Another free counter spell, or a free spell, which still exists in the Pauper format, but with the addition of Gush and, well, Daze, which is another thing that was banned. You can see how the free cost of discarding an island plus another card, you just discard both the lands you play, or maybe one of the other cards that you drew with Gush. You counter the spell, you've drawn more cards, you've seen farther into your deck, you probably draw another Spell Pierce, another counter spell, another threat. Like, everything got crazy, which is why the Blue Winter was ended. We got the May 20th, 2019 banned and restricted announcement banning Gush, Gitaxian Probe, and Daze. Gitaxian Probe used against the blue deck to see if they have the counter spell. The blue decks would play Gitaxian Probe to see if their opponent had what they needed to and how they can react in that sense, play out the threat, use up the mana, whatever it might be. It all had to be stopped. Daze is an oppressive magic card if you're not allowed to do busted things, because Daze in Legacy presents a problem, or presents a solution to a problem, where if you don't have the turn 1 win, generally, so I'm going to have the answer. We're going to play some back and forth, but that's what Legacy allows. It allows for these busted, crazy interactions to happen. Daze Enforcer will police the format, but Pauper doesn't have busted, crazy interactions. That is really powerful interactions. There aren't consistent turn 1 wins. So far, the Pauper Bannings have prevented that. The crazy storm decks that have popped up every so often that they've tried to make work, those aren't a thing. So days can't be allowed. And we essentially had Days Force of Will, where Gush and Foil essentially attempted that. Foil is still allowed in the format because it takes a lot of resources. You require 3 spells to have the effect of 1. Foil plus the 2 cards you discard. That's fine. But when you have cards like Gush allowing that and free spells like Cataxian Probe, things get a little complicated. And so we don't have the crazy legacy stuff going on, but we still have some power creep. The blue decks are still approaching some insane peak point where the tempo and the back and forth and the outplay that you have with these cheap interactive spells are going a little insane. It's getting too far. And I'm wondering if the answer is banning something like Spell Pierce. I'm not sure, but really it's a discussion of where we're at right now. Is blue the problem, or are we just forgetting other things that are still a problem? People have talked about how, well, you know, Alex Ullman has brought up in this article, by the way, great article. I highly recommend you read it. I'm going to link it down below. A discussion about engines, and an important one that he lists here and is still a very prevalent discussion to this day is the artifacts in the format. One of the big pulls to the format is, as I mentioned, its power, and that can be seen very clearly in the artifact lands. All 5 of them are legal in the format, the original ones from Mirrodin. And those artifact lands enable a lot of very powerful affinity shenanigans. And recently we've had the printing of dual affinity lands that come in tap but tap for 1 of 2, and they're indestructible, which is the key. The original artifact lands are not indestructible. They are very much interactable. And so you can destroy them with land destruction, you can destroy them with artifact hate, but you can't do so either with this. And so you have cards like Murren Forces that are everywhere with frog mites, and you attach other enchantments to them and tempo your opponent out with, you know, mana leaks that are 1 mana, just all this crazy stuff that the artifacts do. These are just as powerful. There are 2 big artifact decks in the format right now. One that is tempo based and kind of just a better Bogles, really, when you think about it. And then the other crazy one where you have like these crazy turns of crazy draws, you play a bunch of Murren Forces, frog mites, blah, 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 and all this counter magic to protect it. It's good. Archetype is good. But what about the other boogeyman that I listed, where we have the burn decks trying to go under the blue decks, where the artifact shenanigans are continuing in it to go under the counter magic? You have decks like Burn playing artifacts like Experimental Synthesizer to not only provide them tempo, but the type matters, because when Burn is playing Galvanic Blast, you can tell that they need some legs. They need some speed. They need a bit more damage to make their mana count. And that's where I want to end this video off. That's where I want to present the question to you. Do you think blue is becoming an increasing problem in the Pauper metagame? Do you think that there's a solution? I'm not sure if it's become a problem just yet, but I think it's approaching it. I think it's very obvious that every time you queue up to a Pauper league, or maybe you play Pauper at your locals, there's a lot of blue around and it's very powerful. And eventually with a downshift or a printing, I think it'll get over the top. If Cryptic Serpent hasn't put it already over there, I think it could become worse, or is as worse right now as the Artifact Menace is, or people were complaining about. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And honestly, it's not going to stop me from playing Pauper, but it's going to keep me watching.